Customer analytics is critical to a business. Companies utilizing customer analysis are more likely to increase 126% in profit, 131% in sales, 186% in sales growth. But knowing these big numbers will be useless without action. So how can customer analytics be applied to businesses? Today, we will tackle on how customer analytics can improve the data-driven industry of casinos. Technavio's market analysts have predicted a 10% growth of global casino game market from 2020 to 2024, with the growing popularity of online gambling as a key factor. Revenue of this industry is driven by the patron spending patterns, which is expanding beyond the traditional slot machines and table games, to include services offered by the hotels, restaurants, and many others. This process generates an invaluable amount of customer data that the business can leverage for analytics. Here are a few examples of how casinos can utilize customer analytics. Customer analytics helps casinos know more about their patrons. Consolidating data from various touchpoints throughout the property and social media helps the casinos generate a comprehensive view of their patrons. This can be used to analyze what type of person the patron is, understand why they are playing on a specific property, and what games and services do they usually purchase. Casino can utilize this by creating personalized marketing campaigns. Knowing who are most likely to respond to offers, and recognizing players that needs enhanced odds for winning will certainly boost marketing and sales. Chart customer value over time. Once the data has been structured, we can utilize it to calculate the patron value using historical data and predict up to how much are they willing to pay for future games and services. We can also use analytics to compute how much he can win in the future. Another way to find out a patron's value is by classifying them based on skills and the amounts of bet that they place. These two indicators will help the business focus on high-profit players while offering new services to players who are losing more to keep them longer. Anticipate patron behavior. By using a predictive model, we can look at any season or time pattern that a patron has when visiting the property and help us determine the next day that they are most likely to return. We can also segment our customers based on when they play or who they play with using the patterns on this data. We can also identify which patrons are most likely to abuse offers by looking at customer survey data and historical customer service. Identifying risky patrons can help casinos manage customers and rectify it if they had bad experience. These things will be possible if we could easily process data coming from different sources and formats and feed them to machine learning models that will help us deliver actionable insights from the data. One such tool is Alteryx. Alteryx is a drag-and-drop visual workflow which requires little to no programming to create seamless blending and preparation from different data sources. It is an end-to-end data manipulation tool that can help us incorporate descriptive and predictive analytics. It's also named by Gartner as a leader in its 2020 Magic Quadrant for data science and machine learning platforms. But how can our audience understand this important information without visualization? Qlik is a self-service data visualization tool with sophisticated AI and high-performance cloud platform. It has a modern and user-friendly interface for modeling data, creating visualizations, layouts, and stories. It's also a leader in Gartner's 2020 Analytics and BI Magic Quadrant. We will be utilizing Alteryx and Qlik on our sample casino data to help us apply customer analytics. Our dataset consists of a sample casino game transaction in Alteryx database format and a mock customer dataset in Excel. Before we create our models, we need to prep and check our data first. List your fields using the Select tool and look at the data types of your dataset. If you are using numerical variables for your data, make sure to convert it to a numeric data type. We can do so by using a multi-field formula tool and selecting the text fields that need to be converted. Change its output to a numeric one. In this case, we're using a fixed decimal and with the expression to number of the current field. You can also add additional fields by using a formula tool. Then we are summarizing the transaction by customer ID, day, and game type to get the daily level of each game type played by our patron. We also did the same preparation process to our customer dataset. First, we are going to calculate the patron's worth using a forest model. In doing so, we need to summarize the data to the patron's level, and we also fetched the additional customer data from our dataset. Then, we took a random 50% of customer data for testing. So the random 50% will be run through the forest model, while the rest will be used for validation. In configuring the forest model, we have selected to predict the variable casino win-loss in HKD currency. This is the calculated amount of how much the casino earned from a patron's game. And then we have selected the predictor variables that could have affected the targeted variable, such as game count, time on device, total buy-in, total walk width, patron's win or loss in HKD, their average wager, and their salary. We let the other settings to default and added a score tool. This will append the predicted amount from our model to the dataset. We will then proceed to our next process. Now we are going to predict the date of the patron's next visit. First, we need the data to be summarized by day. Then, using a multi-row formula tool, we are going to calculate the number of days between each specific patron's gaming day. To do so, we are utilizing the multi-row formula. We have configured it to create a new field called days in between gaming days, grouped by customer ID, with the expression of daytime difference between the current row and the row above in days format. Now that we have the calculated field, we can now summarize our data to customer level and get the average days in between his gaming days. In creating a predictive model, we need to know which variables can be a good predictor to our target variable. The association analysis tool will help do just that. Select the possible variables that you want to check and the target variable you want to predict, together with the measure of association that is appropriate to use. The output of this tool will show either a positive or negative association to the target variable, with the positive value being the most likely to be a good variable for our predictive model. You also need to keep in mind that there should be no null values in your predictor variables, or else you will encounter an error when running your model. To ensure that the data is clean, we can use the data cleansing tool. Select the fields you need and replace nulls with zeros. Now we are ready to configure our model. This time we will use a linear regression model. Since we will not be directly predicting the date of the patron's next visit, we will be predicting the possible number of days to pass before they visit again. We have selected the predictor variables as the average days in between gaming days, game count, and the time on device. Again, we need to add the score tool to append the predicted results of our model. Once done, we can now compute for the possible days of the patron's next visit by adding the predicted date to our current day or our base date. This time, we are going to categorize the customer based on their preferred type of game. We currently have 3 on our dataset: ETL, slots, and table games. But first, we need to summarize our dataset to get the count of games per category by customer ID. Then, we used a cross-tab tool so that we will have a new field for each category with the game count as the value for each. Again, we need to ensure that we have no null values, so we also used a data cleansing tool to replace null with zeros for the new fields that we have. Once done, we can now feed it to a K-centroids cluster model. But how can we check how many number of clusters will be appropriate for our dataset? Before running it to a model, we used a K-centroids diagnostics tool to check how many clusters would be good for our data. The output will show a whisker chart to show the distribution of data for each specific number of clusters. Once you have selected a good number of cluster for your data, we can now use the K-centroids cluster analysis tool. We have configured it to group the data based on the ETL, slots, and table values with K-medians as the clustering method. Then, we have added the append cluster to add the cluster number to our data. We also included the category based on each cluster number by using an if-else statement on a formula tool. Our next process will be to compute the patron's win percentage. To do so, we added a field that will mark 1 if the patron won the game, meaning he earned them more than 0 during the game, and mark as 0 if not. Then, we summarized the data by the total games they played, the total number of games they won, and grouped it by customer ID. To compute the win percentage, we added a new field with this expression: games won divided by total games played, then multiplied by 100. Now that we have done the rest of the process, we can now combine it to a single stream. Using a join multiple tool, we joined all 4 connections by customer ID and deselected the duplicate fields. Our last process would be to group patrons depending on their player type. Same as earlier, we are going to use the K-centroids cluster analysis tool. The fields used for clustering were game count, the patron worth, average days in between gaming days, and the win percentage. We clustered it using K-medians in 3 clusters. Finally, we added a cluster name for each corresponding cluster number on a formula tool, and then save the output to a QVX file that we will feed to Qlik. Creating your own dashboard is easy in Qlik. First, direct to your dataset file. Qlik also supports multiple file formats and API connections as seen below. We are going to select our QVX file output from Alteryx as the dataset. To create a chart, drag a specific type from the chart list into the blank dashboard. Then, select a dimension and measure to use. Additional configuration can be done with a sidebar on the right. In our finished dashboard, we created the top 10 patrons based on their worth using a bar graph. Beside it is a tree-map chart with the count of customers per preferred game category. Below, we have a horizontal bar chart showing the number of customers expected to visit again for that day, and a pie graph that shows the percentage of patrons per player type. In the next sheet, we have a tabular data of our patron information, and a small graph of the percentage of customers by gender and by civil status. Lastly is a list of top point earning customers.